Cassandra Cass Whitaker arrived at the Riverside Civilian Training Facility on a Tuesday morning in September, carrying nothing but a worn duffel bag and a manila folder containing her application for the medical assistant position. At 32, she had the kind of quiet presence that made people forget she was in the room. Brown hair always pulled back in a practical ponytail, slender build that seemed almost fragile, and those unusual gray eyes that never quite met anyone's gaze directly. The facility was a converted military base that now served as a training ground for private security contractors, law enforcement agencies, and military veterans transitioning to civilian careers. The smell of gun oil and testosterone hung heavy. In the air and everywhere Cass looked, she saw the same thing. Men. Big men, loud men, men who walked with the swagger of people who'd seen combat and lived to tell about it. Her interview with the facility director, a barrel-chested former Army sergeant named Marcus Rodriguez, lasted exactly 7 minutes. He barely glanced at her resume before sliding it across his desk. Medical assistant, huh? Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, studying her with barely concealed skepticism. You ever work with real soldiers before, sweetheart? This isn't some suburban hospital. These guys come in with attitude problems, not paper cuts. I can handle whatever comes my way, Cass replied quietly, her voice steady despite the condescending tone. Rodriguez's laugh was sharp and dismissive. We'll see about that. Job pays minimum wage, no benefits for the first 6 months. You'll be cleaning rooms, restocking supplies, basic first aid when someone scrapes their knee. Think you can manage that without getting your feelings hurt? Cass nodded once. When do I start? Tomorrow. Don't be late. As she left the office, Cass caught snippets of conversation from the hallway. Rodriguez's voice carried through the thin walls. Hired some quiet little thing for the medical bay. Give her a week before she runs crying back to mommy. The laughter that followed burned in her ears, but her expression never changed. She'd heard worse, much worse. That first week, Cass moved through the facility like a shadow. She arrived before dawn, long before the trainees stumbled in, smelling of coffee and bravado. She cleaned the medical bay with methodical precision, organized supplies with military efficiency, and maintained the practice equipment with the kind of attention to detail that would have impressed a drill sergeant. The trainees barely acknowledged her existence. To them, she was just another piece of furniture useful when they needed a bandage or aspirin, invisible the rest of the time. They called her the ghost nurse behind her back, snickering as she passed by with her arms full of clean linens or medical supplies. Hey, ghost nurse. Jake Morrison, a former Marine with more muscles than sense, called out one afternoon as she restocked the first aid station. You got anything for a broken heart? My girlfriend just dumped me for a real man. The group around him erupted in laughter. Cass didn't even look up from her work. She's probably mute, another trainee, Tommy Blake, chimed in. Haven't heard her say more than 2 words since she got here. Maybe she's one of those weird religious types, Morrison continued. You know, the ones who think talking to men is a sin. Cass finished organizing the bandages and walked away without a word. But those gray eyes for just a moment held something that might have been amusement or pity. Rodriguez seemed to take particular pleasure in finding new ways to diminish her. Every interaction was designed to remind her of her place in the facility's hierarchy, which was somewhere below the cleaning supplies and just above the trash cans. Nurse Know-It-All. He'd bellow across the training floor, that nickname dripping with sarcasm. Get over here and clean up this mess. And try not to faint at the sight of a little blood. The mess was usually nothing more than a small cut from a clumsy recruit or some spilled coffee. But Rodriguez would stand there with his arms crossed, watching her work with that same condescending smile, making sure everyone knew exactly how little he thought of her. Late at night, when the facility was quiet and the trainees had gone home to their families or their bottles, Cass would sit alone in the medical bay. She'd clean and organize the equipment with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. Her movements economical and practiced. There was something almost meditative about the routine checking expiration dates, rotating stock, ensuring everything was exactly where it should be. On her wrist, she wore an old military watch that she never took off. Sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, she would touch it gently, as if drawing strength from some distant memory. The watch face was scratched and worn, but it kept perfect time, the kind of timepiece a soldier would depend on when seconds mattered more than life itself. The photograph in her small apartment told a story she never shared with anyone. It showed an older man in military dress uniform, his eyes sharp and focused, standing at attention with the bearing of someone who'd earned every ribbon on his chest. The nameplate read, J. Whitaker, but those who knew military history would recognize him as something far more significant. Jack Phantom Whitaker, the legendary sniper whose impossible shots had become the stuff of legend among special forces operators worldwide. But here, in this place where swagger and loud voices commanded respect, Cass remained what she'd always been since her father's death 3 years ago, a ghost, moving through the world unnoticed, carrying secrets that could change everything. If anyone cared enough to look beneath the surface, the real question wasn't whether she belonged here. The question was whether any of them were worthy of what she had to offer. The accident happened on a Thursday afternoon during what should have been routine target practice. The new recruit, a 22-year-old kid named Danny Fletcher, who'd been bragging all week about his hunting experience back in Montana, decided to show off with one of the facility's M16 rifles. Cass was in the equipment room, quietly organizing medical supplies, when she heard the sharp crack of the misfire, followed immediately by a scream that cut through the autumn air like a blade. Every instinct her father had drilled into her over countless training sessions kicked in at once. She was moving before her conscious mind had even processed what was happening. When she reached the firing range, the scene was chaos. Fletcher was on the ground, clutching his left shoulder where the rifle's unexpected recoil had driven the barrel into his collarbone with enough force to tear through skin and muscle. Blood was streaming between his fingers, and his face had gone the color of old paper. The other trainees stood frozen in a loose circle around him, their faces painted with that particular mix of shock and fascination that comes from seeing real violence up close. Someone was shouting for Rodriguez. Someone else was fumbling with their cell phone, trying to call 911. Move. Cass's voice cut through the noise with quiet authority as she dropped to her knees beside Fletcher. Her hands were already moving, applying direct pressure to the wound with precision that spoke of extensive training. Jesus, Danny, you're bleeding everywhere, Morrison said, his earlier bravado completely gone. Should we get me clean towels from the medical bay? Cass interrupted, not looking up from her work. And the trauma kit from the red cabinet. Now, her fingers found the exact pressure point needed to control the arterial bleeding. The technique was flawless, the kind of advanced field medicine that usually took years of combat experience to master. Fletcher's bleeding slowed immediately. How did you, Tommy Blake started to ask, but Cass cut him off. Danny, look at me. Her voice was calm, steady, completely in control. You're going to be fine. The wound looks worse than it is. Just breathe and let me work. Fletcher's eyes focused on her face, and some of the panic left his expression. There was something in her gray eyes, a confidence that came from having dealt with much worse than this. Morrison returned with the supplies, and Cass worked with the kind of methodical efficiency that made it look easy. She cleaned the wound, applied a proper field dressing, and had Fletcher stabilized within 10 minutes. By the time the paramedics arrived, He was sitting up and complaining about missing the rest of practice. "Nice work," one of the EMTs said to Cass as they loaded Fletcher onto the stretcher. "You military?" "Just took a lot of first aid courses," she replied quietly, already cleaning blood from her hands. But Rodriguez, who had arrived just as the ambulance was pulling away, had a different perspective on the incident. He found Cass in the medical bay afterward, reorganizing the supplies she'd used. "Well, well," he said, leaning against the doorframe with that familiar smirk. "Look who finally decided to be useful. Though I have to say, for someone who's just a medical assistant, you sure seem to know your way around a trauma situation." Cass didn't look up from her work. "I did what needed to be done. Is that so?" Rodriguez pushed off from the doorframe and walked closer. "You know what I think, Nurse Know-It-All? I think you're hiding something. Nobody gets that good at emergency medicine from taking a few Red Cross classes." Still no response from Cass, but her hands had stopped moving. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. "Here's the thing," Rodriguez continued, his voice dropping to a more menacing tone. "I don't like mysteries. I don't like people who show up at my facility with fake resumes and mysterious backgrounds. So why don't you tell me where you really learned to play doctor?" Finally, Cass looked up. Her gray eyes met his brown ones directly for the first time since she'd started working there. "I learned from someone who believed in being prepared for when things go wrong." That's not an answer. It's the only answer you're getting. The standoff lasted another few seconds before Rodriguez laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor. "You know what, Nurse Know-It-All? I'm starting to think you're more trouble than you're worth. Maybe it's time to consider whether this position is really working out." The threat hung in the air between them, unspoken but perfectly clear. Cass went back to organizing her supplies, but Rodriguez wasn't finished. "And another thing," he said, his voice carrying the particular cruelty that comes from someone who enjoys having power over others. "I don't want to see any more of these dramatic rescue scenes. You're not a paramedic, you're not a doctor, and you're sure as hell not some kind of hero. You're a medical assistant. Act like one." After he left, Cass sat alone in the medical bay, staring at her hands. They were steady. They'd been steady throughout the entire incident, steady as her father had trained them to be. But now, in the quiet aftermath, she could feel the weight of what had just happened. She'd saved Danny Fletcher from what could have been a life-threatening injury. She'd done it efficiently, professionally, and without hesitation. And her reward was a threat to her job, and a reminder that her place was to be invisible, not capable. That night, she called her father's old friend, Colonel Ellis, the one person who knew the truth about her background. Their conversation was brief. "They don't know who you are," Alice said after she'd described the incident. "And maybe that's for the best right now. I can't keep pretending to be less than I am," Cass replied. "It's not what he would have wanted. Your father would have wanted you to be safe. He would have wanted you to choose your battles carefully. What if I'm tired of not fighting at all?" There was a long pause before Ellis answered. "Then, when the time comes, make sure it's a battle worth winning." As she hung up the phone, Cass touched her father's watch and made a silent promise. She would continue to do her job, continue to help where she could, and continue to endure Rodriguez's contempt. But she would also be ready, because sooner or later, the time would come when being invisible wouldn't be enough. The mandatory marksmanship test was announced on a Monday morning in October, 3 weeks after the Fletcher incident. Rodriguez stood in front of the assembled trainees with a clipboard in one hand and that familiar predatory smile on his face. "Listen up, people," he announced, his voice carrying across the morning muster. "Next Friday, we're having a facility-wide marksmanship competition. Everyone participates, and I mean everyone. Trainees, instructors, and yes, even support staff. Cass felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She'd been dreading this moment for 3 years, ever since she'd made the promise to her father that she'd never pick up a rifle again. This is about team building, Rodriguez continued, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found her. About showing that everyone at this facility is committed to excellence, regardless of their role. No exceptions. After the announcement, the facility buzzed with excitement. The trainees spent their breaks discussing strategy, comparing their previous shooting experiences, and placing bets on who would score highest. The conversation inevitably turned to the support staff. $20 says the ghost nurse doesn't even hit the target board, Morrison laughed, loud enough for Cass to hear as she passed by with a load of laundry. I'll take that bet, Blake replied. But I'm betting she finds some excuse not to participate at all. Probably claims she's got a religious objection or something. Or maybe she'll faint when she sees the gun, added another trainee. Some people just can't handle weapons. Cass kept walking, but their words followed her like barbed wire. She'd handled weapons before handled them better than any of these men could imagine. But that was before the promise, before the guilt, before she decided that some skills were too dangerous to use. Rodriguez found her in the medical bay that afternoon, carrying a military-grade M24 sniper rifle like it was a bouquet of flowers. Well, Nurse Know-It-All, he said, setting the rifle down on a medical table with deliberate ceremony. I've got something special picked out just for you. Cass stared at the weapon. It was similar to the one her father had used, the same basic platform that had made him a legend among military snipers. The sight of it brought back a flood of memories, early mornings on the range. Her father's patient voice explaining wind patterns and bullet trajectories. The satisfaction of hitting targets at impossible distances. Problem is, Rodriguez continued, I'm not sure you can actually handle a real weapon. I mean, cleaning them is one thing, but actually firing one? That takes a different kind of person. I can handle it, Cass said quietly. Can you now? Rodriguez's smile widened. Because I have to tell you, I'm starting to wonder if you're really cut out for this job. Between your mysterious background and your tendency to play hero, I'm thinking maybe you'd be happier working somewhere else. Somewhere more ... suitable for someone with your limitations. The threat was clear. Participate in the shooting competition. And risk exposing skills she'd sworn never to use again, or refuse and give Rodriguez the excuse he needed to fire her. The target will be set at 300 meters, Rodriguez said, picking up the rifle and checking the action with professional competence. Standard bullseye target. Should be easy enough for someone who's taken a lot of first aid courses, right? That evening, Cass sat in her small apartment, staring at the photograph of her father. The memory of their last conversation played in her mind like a broken record. Promise me something, Cassie, he'd said from his hospital bed, his voice weak but his eyes still sharp. Promise me you'll never use what I taught you for the wrong reasons. And promise me you'll know the difference when the time comes. She'd made that promise. She'd meant it then, and she'd honored it for 3 years. But now, faced with Rodriguez's ultimatum, she found herself questioning what the wrong reasons really were. Was it wrong to want to defend herself against a bully who was systematically trying to destroy her career? Was it wrong to want to show these men that their assumptions about her were not just incorrect, but dangerously naive? Was it wrong to want to honor her father's memory by demonstrating that his training hadn't been wasted? The next morning, she found Lieutenant Colonel Ellis waiting for her in the facility parking lot. He was in civilian clothes, but his military bearing was unmistakable. You might be having some trouble, he said without preamble. Word. Travels fast, Cass replied. Your father asked me to keep an eye on you. I promised him I would. They walked in silence for a moment before Ellis continued. He also told me something else. He said there would come a day when you'd have to choose between the promise you made to him and the promise you made to yourself. What promise did I make to myself? To never let anyone make you smaller than you are. Cass stopped walking. I can't pick up that rifle, Colonel. Not after what happened. Not after what I promised. Your father never wanted you to be helpless. Cassie, he wanted you to be responsible. There's a difference. Is there? Because right now, it feels like the same thing. Alice was quiet for a long moment. Your father once told me that the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone underestimates. He said the person has a choice. They can use that advantage to help people, or they can use it to hurt them. But they can't choose not to use it at all. What's that supposed to mean? It means that whether you pick up that rifle or not, you're making a choice. The question is, what kind of choice is it going to be? That night, Cass made her decision. She would participate. In the marksmanship test, she would pick up the rifle. And she would finally stop pretending to be less than she was. But she would do it on her own terms, for her own reasons, and in a way that would honor both the promise she'd made to her father and the promise she was finally ready to make to herself. The ghost was about to become visible. The night before the marksmanship test, Cass couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her father's watch ticking steadily on the nightstand beside her. Every few minutes, she would glance at the photograph on her dresser, searching her father's face for some sign of what he would want her to do. At 3 a.m., she gave up on sleep altogether and drove to the facility. The security guard, a grizzled veteran named Pete, who worked the night shift, barely looked up as she badged in. "Working late again, Miss Whitaker?" "Something like that," she replied. The facility was different, at night quieter, more serious somehow. Without the constant chatter and posturing of the trainees, the place felt like what it really was. A training ground where people prepared for life-and-death situations. Cass made her way to the equipment room where the M24 rifle was stored. She stood looking at it for a long time, remembering the last time she'd held a similar weapon. That had been 3 years ago, at her father's funeral, when the honor guard had presented her with his service rifle. She'd accepted it with steady hands and a breaking heart, then locked it away in a closet where it remained to this day. "You're up early." The voice startled her. She turned to find Williams, the old instructor who'd served with her father, standing in the doorway. At 72, he still moved with the careful precision of a career soldier, but his eyes held the weight of someone who'd seen too much. "Couldn't sleep," Cass said. Williams nodded as if he understood. "Mind if I join you? I've been having trouble sleeping myself lately. Too many old memories stirring up." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before Williams continued. "I knew your father for 20 years. Served with him in the Gulf, Bosnia, Afghanistan. Best sniper I ever saw, but that's not what made him special." "What did?" "He never took a shot unless it was absolutely necessary. And when it was necessary, he never missed." Williams paused, studying her face. "He talked about you all the time. Showed me pictures of you on the range when you were just a kid. Said you had a gift." Cass felt her throat tighten. "He taught me a lot of things." "I bet he did. But I'm guessing the most important thing he taught you wasn't about shooting at all." "What do you mean?" "He taught you when not to shoot. That's the hardest lesson of all." Williams reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook, worn and faded from years of use. "Your father asked me to give you this if you ever needed it. Said you'd know when the time was right." Cass opened the notebook. Inside, in her father's careful handwriting, were pages of shooting calculations, wind charts, and range notes. But on the first page, there was a message addressed to her. "Cassie, if you're reading this, it means you've reached a point where you need to remember who you are. Not who you were, not who you're supposed to be, but who you are. The skills I taught you aren't a burden. They're a responsibility. Use them wisely. Use them only when necessary. But when that time comes, don't hesitate. The world needs people who can make the hard shots when it matters. Love, Dad. He wrote that 2 weeks before he died, Williams said quietly. He knew you'd made a promise to give up shooting, and he respected that. But he also knew that sometimes life doesn't give us the luxury of keeping every promise we make to ourselves. Cass closed the notebook, her hands trembling slightly. I'm scared, Mr. Williams. Not of the shooting. I know I can still do that. I'm scared of what happens after. I'm scared of who I might become. Your father was scared too, every time he pulled the trigger. That's what made him good at it. The day you stop being scared is the day you become dangerous for the wrong reasons. Williams headed toward the door, then paused. One more thing your father told me. He said that the most important shot isn't the one that proves you can hit a target. It's the one that protects someone who can't protect themselves. After Williams left, Cash spent the rest of the night in the equipment room, reading through her father's notes and remembering their training sessions. By the time the sun came up, she had made her peace with what she was about to do. The morning of the test, the facility was buzzing with excitement. Trainees gathered in small groups, discussing their strategies and making last-minute bets. The support staff, the cooks, maintenance workers, and administrators looked nervous but determined. Rodriguez arrived wearing his dress uniform, looking like he was preparing for a military inspection rather than a training exercise. He gathered everyone on the range and began explaining the rules. Simple format, he announced. 1 shot per person. Target at 300 meters. Bullseye scores 10 points. Outer rings score accordingly. Highest score wins. His eyes found Cass in the crowd. And just to make things interesting, lowest score buys drinks for everyone. The laughter that followed was sharp and knowing. Everyone understood the subtext. This was designed to humiliate the support staff, and Cass in particular. The shooting began with the instructors, who performed competently but without distinction. Most hit the target. A few managed the outer rings of the bullseye, and one managed a solid center shot that drew polite applause. The trainees went next, and their performances were similar adequate, but nothing spectacular. Morrison managed a decent shot that earned him some backslapping from his friends. Blake missed the target entirely and endured good-natured ribbing from the crowd. Then it was time for the support staff. The cook, a nervous man in his 50s, managed to hit the target board, but nowhere near the bullseye. The maintenance chief did slightly better, earning encouraging nods from the crowd. Finally, Rodriguez called out the name everyone had been waiting for: Cassandra Whitaker. The crowd fell silent as Cass walked to the firing line. Rodriguez handed her the M24 rifle with exaggerated ceremony, his smile wider than it had been all day. Take your time, Nurse Know-It-All, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Remember, this is a real weapon, not a thermometer. The laughter was cruel and expectant. They were all waiting for her to fail, to prove their assumptions about her limitations. They were waiting for her to confirm that she was exactly what she appeared to be, a quiet, unremarkable woman who had no business being around real soldiers. Cass accepted the rifle and walked to the firing line. As her hands closed around the familiar weight of the weapon, something fundamental shifted in her posture. The uncertain medical assistant disappeared, replaced by someone else entirely. She was Jack, Phantom, Whitaker's daughter. And it was time to stop hiding. The moment Cass lifted the rifle, the atmosphere on the range changed completely. The casual chatter died away, replaced by an almost electric tension as every person present sensed that something significant was about to happen. She moved with a fluid precision that spoke of thousands of hours of practice, adjusting her stance with microscopic corrections that transformed her. from a hesitant civilian into something that looked decidedly more dangerous. The rifle seemed to disappear into her hands, becoming an extension of her body rather than a separate tool. "Jesus," someone whispered. "Look at her stance." Williams, standing at the back of the crowd, felt his breath catch. The positioning was perfect textbook. Perfect, but more than that, it was unmistakably familiar. He'd seen Jack Whitaker use that exact stance 100 times, and it had never failed to produce results. Rodriguez's confident smirk faltered slightly as he watched her preparations. This wasn't the nervous fumbling he'd expected from someone who'd allegedly learned to shoot from first aid courses. This was something else entirely. Cass ignored the murmurs around her, focusing instead on the familiar ritual her father had drilled into her since childhood. She checked the wind, noting the slight breeze coming from the northwest at approximately 8 miles per hour. The target was 300 meters away, child's play, compared to some of the shots her father had trained her to make. She settled into her shooting position, the rifle scope coming up to her eye with the kind of muscle memory that only comes from years of repetition. Through the scope, the target looked impossibly close. She could see the individual scoring rings, the slight discoloration in the paper where previous bullets had passed nearby. Her breathing slowed automatically to the rhythm her father had taught her. 4 counts in, hold for 2, 4 counts out, hold for 2. Her heartbeat, which had been elevated since the moment Rodriguez had announced the competition, began to settle into the steady cadence she needed. "Any day now, sweetheart," Rodriguez called out, his voice carrying a hint of impatience. "It's not exactly rocket science." But Cass was no longer hearing him. She was back on her father's ranch in Montana, 8 years old again, learning the fundamentals of marksmanship from a man who understood that precision shooting was part science, part art, and part spiritual discipline. "It's not about the gun, Cassie," her father's voice echoed in her memory. "It's about the moment between heartbeats when everything becomes perfectly still. That's when you take the shot." She found that moment now, that perfect stillness where the rifle became an extension of her will, and the target became the only thing that existed in the universe. Her finger found the trigger, applying the slow, steady pressure her father had taught her, not a jerk, not a pull, but a gradual increase in force that would surprise even her when the rifle finally fired. The shot cracked across the range like thunder. For a moment, nobody moved. The sound seemed to hang in the air, followed by the kind of absolute silence that comes after something extraordinary has happened. Then someone Williams probably let out a low whistle of amazement. "Spotter," Rodriguez called out, his voice suddenly much less confident than it had been moments before. The instructor manning the spotting scope focused on the target, then looked up with an expression of complete disbelief. "Perfect center," he announced. "Dead center bullseye." A collective gasp went up from the crowd. This wasn't just a good shot. This was the kind of precision that separated professionals from amateurs, the kind of accuracy that took years to develop and even longer to master. "That's impossible," Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nobody shoots that well on their first try." "It wasn't her first try," Williams said quietly, but loud enough for those around him to hear. "That shooting stance, that breathing technique, that's Jack Whitaker's signature style." The name hit the crowd like a physical blow. Even the youngest trainees knew that name, knew the stories of impossible shots in impossible conditions, of a sniper who had become a legend among special forces operators worldwide. Rodriguez's face had gone pale. He stared at the target, then at Cass, then back at the target, as if trying to process what he'd just witnessed. That's just beginner's luck," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Sir," Williams stepped forward, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd earned his stripes in actual combat. Permission to speak freely? Rodriguez nodded, still staring at the target. That wasn't luck, Williams said. That was textbook precision shooting. The stance, the breathing, the trigger control, I've seen that exact technique before. 20 years ago, in Afghanistan, when Sergeant Jack Whitaker put 3 consecutive shots through a 2-inch group at 800 meters. The crowd turned to stare at Cass, who was calmly securing the rifle and preparing to step away from the firing line. She moved with the same quiet efficiency she'd always shown, but now everyone could see what had been hidden in plain sight. All along. You're his daughter, Williams said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. Cass met his eyes directly for the first time since she'd started working at the facility. Yes, sir, I am. The admission rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped into still water. Suddenly, everything made sense. Her medical skills, her calm under pressure, the way she moved through the facility with such quiet confidence. She wasn't just some civilian who'd wandered in off the street. She was military royalty, the daughter of one of the most respected snipers in modern military history. Rodriguez found his voice again, but it came out as a croak. Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you say who you were? Cass looked at him with those gray eyes that no longer seemed quite so uncertain. Because I wanted to see who you were first. The simple statement carried the weight of judgment, and everyone present understood exactly what she meant. For months, they had treated her as less than capable, less than worthy of respect, less than human. They had made assumptions based on her gender, her quiet demeanor, and her willingness to do work they considered beneath them. And now they knew they had been in the presence of greatness all along, and they had been too blind to see it. Marson stepped forward, his earlier bravado completely gone. Ma'am, we didn't know. If we had known, you would have treated me differently, Cass interrupted. But why should my father's reputation change how you see me? Either I'm competent or I'm not. Either I deserve respect or I don't. My last name shouldn't matter. The silence that followed was deafening. They all knew she was right. They all knew that they had failed a test they hadn't even realized they were taking. Rodriguez cleared his throat, looking like a man who had just realized he'd been playing poker with a card sharp. Well, he said, his voice much smaller than it had been all morning. I guess we should head back inside. Competitions over. As the crowd began to disperse, Williams approached Cass. Your father would be proud, he said quietly. Would he? Cass asked. I broke my promise to him. No. Williams shook his head. You kept a different promise, the one you made to yourself. As they walked back toward the facility, Cass could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her. The ghost nurse was gone forever, replaced by someone who could no longer hide behind assumptions and underestimation. The question now was, what came next? The news of Cass's performance spread through the facility like wildfire. By Monday morning, everyone from the janitors to the senior instructors knew that the quiet medical assistant was actually the daughter of Jack Phantom Whitaker, and that she could shoot like her father's daughter should. The change in atmosphere was immediate and profound. The casual dismissal and mockery that had characterized her first months at the facility evaporated overnight, replaced by a mixture of awe, embarrassment, and carefully polite distance. Trainees who had barely acknowledged her existence now nodded respectfully when she passed by. The crude jokes and dismissive comments stopped entirely. But Rodriguez's reaction was different. Instead of the embarrassment or grudging respect that Cass might have expected, he seemed to view her revelation as a personal affront, a calculated deception designed to make him look foolish. You played me, he said, cornering her in the medical bay on Tuesday morning. You set me up to look like an idiot in front of my own people. I did my job, Cass replied calmly, not looking up from the inventory sheet she was reviewing. Nothing more, nothing less. Bullshit. Rodriguez's voice was harsh, carrying the particular venom of someone whose authority had been challenged. You could have told me who you were from day one. Instead, you let me make assumptions. Let me treat. You like what? Cass finally looked up, her gray eyes meeting his directly. Like a woman? Like someone without a famous last name? Like a human being who deserved basic respect regardless of her background? The questions hung in the air like accusations, and Rodriguez's face flushed red. You don't understand how things work around here. This is a military facility. We have protocols, hierarchies, chains of command. You can't just what? Do my job competently? Save someone's life? Demonstrate skills that I've spent years developing? Cass set down her clipboard and faced him fully. Or are you saying I can't do those things without your permission? Rodriguez stepped closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. I'm saying that I don't like being made to look like a fool. And I'm saying that people who make me look like a fool tend to find working here ... difficult. Is that a threat? It's a reality check. You might be Jack Whitaker's daughter, but he's not here to protect you. I am the authority at this facility, and if you think one lucky shot is going to change that, you're about to learn otherwise. That afternoon, the retaliation began. It started small. Her supply orders were delayed. Her work schedule was changed without notice, and she found herself assigned to increasingly menial tasks that had nothing to do with medical assistance. When she arrived at work Wednesday morning, she discovered that her access card had been deactivated. Computer glitch, Rodriguez explained with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Should be fixed soon. In the meantime, you'll need to be escorted. Everywhere by security. For your own safety, of course. The escort was Pete, the night security guard, who looked deeply uncomfortable with his new assignment. I'm sorry about this, Miss Whitaker, he said as he walked her to the medical bay. This ain't right, and we all know it. It's okay, Pete. Just doing your job. But it wasn't okay, and everyone knew it. Rodriguez was systematically dismantling her ability to function at the facility, creating obstacles and humiliations designed to force her resignation. When she tried to restock medical supplies, she was told the inventory system was under review. When trainees came to her with minor injuries, they were redirected to outside medical personnel, regardless of cost or inconvenience. By Thursday, the situation had escalated further. Cass arrived at work to find her small office had been reassigned to visiting personnel, and her belongings had been moved to a storage closet that barely had room for a desk. Temporary space reassignment, Rodriguez's assistant, a nervous woman named Linda, explained apologetically. Just until we can find you something more ... appropriate. The message was clear. Rodriguez was making her position untenable, creating conditions so unpleasant that any reasonable person would quit rather than endure the constant humiliation. But Cass wasn't any reasonable person. She was her father's daughter, and Jack Whitaker had never backed down from a fight when the cause was just. That evening, she made 2 phone calls. The first was to Colonel Ellis. He's trying to force me out, she explained, describing Rodriguez's campaign of petty harassment and professional sabotage. Do you have documentation? Alice asked. Some, but most of it is the kind of thing that's hard to prove: delays, reassignments, computer glitches. He's being careful not to create an obvious paper trail. What do you want to do about it? Cass was quiet for a moment, thinking. I want to fight, but I want to do it the right way. Meaning? Meaning I want to beat him using the rules he thinks he controls. The second call was to Williams, who listened quietly as she described her situation. Your father faced something similar once, he said when she finished. Commanding officer who thought Jack was getting too much attention, too much respect from the men. started making his life difficult in all the little ways that don't show up in official reports. What did Dad do? He waited. He documented everything. And when the time was right, he presented his case to the Inspector General with enough evidence to bury the man's career. Williams paused, but he also made sure he had allies. People who would speak up for him when it mattered. I don't know if I have allies here. You might be surprised. Your shooting demonstration opened a lot of eyes. People are starting to ask questions about how you've been treated and whether that treatment reflects the kind of facility they want to work for. Friday morning brought the most serious escalation yet. Cass arrived at work to find a formal letter of reprimand in her personnel file, citing insubordination and failure to follow established protocols during the marksmanship competition. The letter was a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction, describing her shooting demonstration as a dangerous grandstanding incident that violated safety protocols and demonstrated a concerning lack of respect for authority. It recommended immediate corrective action and placed her on probationary status pending a formal review. Rodriguez had made his move. The letter was carefully crafted to create an official justification for her termination, using language that would be difficult to challenge through normal grievance procedures. If she signed it, she would be admitting to misconduct she hadn't committed. If she refused to sign it, she would be accused of further insubordination. It was a classic bureaucratic trap, designed to leave her with no good options. But as Cass read through the letter for the third time, she began to smile. Rodriguez had finally made a mistake. In his eagerness to create an official justification for his harassment, he had put his lies in writing. And in doing so, he had given her exactly what she needed to destroy him. The war was about to begin in earnest. Cass spent her lunch break in the facility's law library, a small room filled with military regulations, employment law texts, and policy manuals that most people never bothered to read. She'd always been thorough in her research, a trait inherited from her father, who had approached every mission with meticulous preparation. What she found was better than she dared hope. The Riverside Civilian Training Facility operated under a complex web of federal contracts, state regulations, and military oversight agreements. As a former military base converted to civilian use, it was subject to specific anti-discrimination policies and whistleblower protection statutes that Rodriguez either didn't know about or had chosen to ignore. More importantly, the facility's contract with the Department of Defense contained explicit language about maintaining professional standards and providing equal treatment to all employees regardless of gender, background, or family connections. Rodriguez's documented pattern of harassment wasn't just unprofessional. It was a violation of federal contract requirements that could jeopardize the facility's primary source of funding. But Cass knew that documentation alone wouldn't be enough. She needed witnesses, allies, people willing to speak on her behalf when the time came. And despite her months of isolation, she was beginning to realize that she had more support than she'd known. It started with Pete, the security guard, who approached her privately after her shift on Friday. "Miss Whitaker, I don't know if this helps, but I've been keeping track of some things," he said, glancing around nervously. "The access card situation, the office reassignment, the way Rodriguez has been talking about you in staff meetings. I wrote it all down with dates and times." "Why?" Cass asked. "Because I served under your father in the Gulf. He saved my life twice, and I've never forgotten it. When I found out who you were ... double quotes, Pete shrugged. Seemed like the least I could do was return the favor. The next ally came from an unexpected source. Linda, Rodriguez's assistant, knocked on the door of Cass's storage closet office Monday morning, looking terrified but determined. "I have something for you," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "Copies of memos Rodriguez has been sending to his supervisors about you. He's been building a case for weeks, making it sound like you're a security risk because of your family background. The memos were damning page after page of Rodriguez's paranoid speculation about Cass's motives, her qualifications, and her potential for violence based on her father's military training. They revealed a man so threatened by her competence that he'd constructed an elaborate fantasy about her being some kind of security threat. "Why are you helping me?" Cass asked. Linda's voice was barely audible. "Because I have a daughter, and someday she might face a situation like this. I want her to know that sometimes people will stand up for what's right, even when it's scary." But the most significant ally emerged during a conversation with Williams in the facility's equipment room. The old instructor had been watching the situation develop with increasing anger, and he was ready to take action. "I've been talking to some of the other instructors," he said. "We're all disgusted by what Rodriguez is doing. Your father was respected by every professional soldier who ever served with him, and the way his daughter is being treated is an insult to his memory." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that Rodriguez has finally picked a fight with the wrong family. Your father had friends, a lot of friends in very high places. It's time to remind Rodriguez that actions have consequences." Williams handed her a business card. "Colonel Marcus Webb, Inspector General's office. He served with your father for 6 years and considers him one of the finest soldiers he ever knew. I called him this morning and told him what's been happening here." Cass stared at the card. "You called the Inspector General?" "I called a friend who happens to work for the Inspector General. There's a difference." Williams smiled grimly. "Webb is driving down from Denver tomorrow to conduct what he's calling a routine facility inspection. Should be very interesting." That evening, Cass worked late in her storage closet office, organizing her evidence into a comprehensive file. She had Rodriguez's harassing memos, Pete's detailed log of incidents, photographs of her office reassignment, copies of the fabricated reprimand letter, and sworn statements from 3 witnesses who had observed Rodriguez's pattern of discriminatory behavior. But the most powerful piece of evidence was Rodriguez himself. In his eagerness to justify his harassment, he had created a paper trail that revealed not just his bias against her, but his fundamental unfitness for command. His memo showed a man who viewed competent subordinates as threats, who confused respect with fear, and who was willing to violate federal regulations to protect his own ego. Tuesday morning, Colonel Webb arrived for his routine inspection, accompanied by 2 investigators from the Inspector General's office. Rodriguez, caught completely off guard, tried to present his usual confident facade, but his nervousness was obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. The inspection began with a review of facility records, personnel files, and operational procedures. Webb, a soft-spoken man with sharp eyes and a reputation for thoroughness, asked seemingly casual questions about employee relations, conflict resolution, and adherence to federal employment guidelines. "I'd like to speak with some of your staff individually," Webb announced after reviewing the basic documentation. "Just routine interviews to get a sense of facility morale and operational efficiency." Rodriguez's confident smile faltered slightly. "Of course, Colonel. Though I should mention that we've had some personnel issues recently. A few problem employees who haven't quite fit in with our professional culture." "Really?" Webb's tone was mild, but Cass caught the subtle sharpening of his attention. "What kind of problems?" "Well, for instance, we have a medical assistant who's been disruptive, insubordinate, and frankly, I have concerns about her psychological stability. She comes from a complicated background." Webb made a note in his file. "I'd like to interview this employee. What's her name?" "Cassandra Whitaker," Rodriguez replied, either missing or ignoring the way Webb's expression changed when he heard the name. "Whitaker," Webb repeated thoughtfully. "Any relation to Jack Whitaker?" Rodriguez nodded eagerly, apparently thinking he was building his case. "His daughter, actually. And between you and me, Colonel, I think she has some serious psychological issues related to her father's death. She's been acting erratically, making threats, demonstrating concerning behavior patterns. Webb's pen stopped moving. When he looked up, his expression was carefully neutral, but there was something in his eyes that would have warned Rodriguez if he'd been paying attention. I see, Webb said quietly. Yes, I think I definitely need to interview Miss Whitaker as soon as possible. Rodriguez had just made the mistake that would end his career. He had slandered the daughter of one of the most respected soldiers in modern military history to a man who had served with that soldier for 6 years and considered him a brother. The trap was set. All that remained was the springing. The interview took place in the facility's main conference room at 2 o'clock Tuesday afternoon. Colonel Webb sat across from Cass with the 2 investigators flanking him, their recording equipment humming quietly on the polished table between them. Miss Whitaker, Webb began, his voice formal but kind. I understand you've been experiencing some workplace difficulties. Yes, sir. Before we discuss those, I want you to know that I served with your father for 6 years. He was one of the finest soldiers and finest men I ever had the privilege to know. His reputation and his sacrifice means something to me personally. Cass felt her throat tighten. Thank you, sir. Now, I want you to tell me everything that's happened here, from the beginning. Take your time and don't leave anything out. For the next hour, Cass laid out her case with the methodical precision her father had taught her. She presented each piece of evidence chronologically, explaining the context and significance of Rodriguez's actions. She was calm, factual, and devastating. The harassment campaign, the systematic professional sabotage, the fabricated reprimand letter, the documented pattern of gender discrimination, the violation of federal employment guidelines, the abuse of authority, the creation of a hostile work environment. Webb and his investigators took notes, asked clarifying questions, and examined each piece of evidence with professional thoroughness. By the time Cass finished her presentation, the case against Rodriguez was overwhelming. Miss Whitaker, one of the investigators said, you've been remarkably thorough in documenting these incidents. Most people don't think to preserve evidence so systematically. My father taught me that preparation and attention to detail can mean the difference between success and failure, Cass replied. I didn't want there to be any doubt about what happened here. Webb leaned back in his chair, studying her with the same sharp assessment he'd once used to evaluate military personnel under his command. What outcome are you seeking? What would constitute justice in your mind? Cass had been thinking about that question for days. I want Mr. Rodriguez removed from his position. I want the facility's policies reviewed and updated to prevent this from happening to anyone else. And I want a formal acknowledgement that his actions were wrong. You're not seeking financial compensation? No, sir. I'm seeking accountability. After the interview, Webb and his team spent the remainder of the afternoon interviewing other facility personnel. Pete provided his detailed log of incidents. Linda presented the harassing memos. Williams and 2 other instructors testified about Rodriguez's pattern of unprofessional behavior. Several trainees, including Morrison and Blake, admitted that they had witnessed and participated in the harassment, expressing genuine remorse for their actions. The picture that emerged was damning. Rodriguez had created a toxic environment where discrimination was tolerated, competence was threatened, and basic human dignity was optional. His leadership style was based on intimidation rather than respect, and his personal insecurities had led him to target the most qualified person on his staff. Wednesday morning, Webb requested a final meeting with Rodriguez. What Rodriguez thought would be a routine debriefing turned into the most humiliating hour of his career. Mr. Rodriguez, Webb began, his voice cold and formal. After conducting a thorough investigation, I have determined that you have violated multiple federal employment regulations, breached your facility's contract with the Department of Defense, and demonstrated a pattern of discriminatory behavior that is wholly unacceptable. Rodriguez's face went pale. Colonel, I think there's been some misunderstanding. There has been no misunderstanding, Webb cut him off. You have systematically harassed an employee based on her gender and family background. You have created false documentation, to justify that harassment. You have violated federal whistleblower protection statutes, and you have slandered the reputation of a deceased war hero. Webb slid a thick folder across the table. This contains copies of all the evidence we've collected, along with statements from 14 facility personnel corroborating the charges against you. Your conduct has been unprofessional, illegal, and frankly, disgraceful. Rodriguez tried one last desperate defense. You don't understand the situation here, Carl. That woman is unstable. She's dangerous. She has access to weapons and stop talking. Webb's voice carried the authority of a man who had commanded soldiers in combat. Every word you say is making this worse for yourself. The consequences were swift and comprehensive. Rodriguez was immediately suspended pending a formal hearing. The facility's contract with the Department of Defense was placed under review. A new management team was brought in to oversee operations and implement policy changes. And Rodriguez himself was referred to the Justice Department for potential criminal prosecution for violations of federal civil rights laws. But for Cass, the most meaningful moment came 3 days later, when the facility's new director, a respected former Air Force colonel named Patricia Hayes, called her into the main conference room. Miss Whitaker, Hayes began, I want to formally apologize for the treatment you received at this facility. It was wrong, it was illegal, and it will never happen again under my leadership. Thank you, ma'am. I also want to offer you a new position. We're creating a head instructor role for our medical training program, with full benefits, a significant salary increase, and the authority to redesign our curriculum according to your professional judgment. Cass was quiet for a moment. I appreciate the offer, ma'am, but I need to think about it. Of course. Take your time. That evening, Cass sat in her apartment, holding her father's photograph and thinking about what he would want her to do. She had won her battle against Rodriguez completely and decisively. Justice had been served, accountability had been established, and the facility was already implementing changes that would protect future employees from similar harassment. But more importantly, she had learned something about herself. She had discovered that she could honor her father's memory not by hiding her capabilities, but by using them responsibly. She could be both Jack Whitaker's daughter and her own person. She could be both a protector and a healer. The next morning, she accepted the position. 6 months later, the Riverside Civilian Training Facility had been transformed. Under Cass's leadership, the medical training program had become one of the most respected in the region. She taught with the same quiet competence she had always shown, but now that competence was recognized, valued, and properly utilized. Rodriguez, meanwhile, had been convicted of federal civil rights violations and sentenced to 2 years in prison. His military pension had been revoked, and he was permanently barred from working at any facility with government contracts. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the culture change at the facility itself. The casual discrimination and toxic masculinity that had characterized Rodriguez's leadership were replaced by an environment of mutual respect and professional excellence. New employees were judged on their abilities, not their gender or background. Competence was celebrated rather than threatened. And in the medical bay, now expanded and modernized under Cass's direction, a new motto hung on the wall. Excellence is not about being better than others. It's about being better than you were yesterday. It was something her father had told her years ago, and something she now shared with every student who walked through her door. The ghost nurse was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who had found her voice, claimed her place, and honored her father's legacy by becoming exactly who she was meant to be. Sometimes the most powerful shot isn't the one that hits the target. Sometimes it's the one that changes everything that comes after. If you've ever seen someone's true value only after they acted with courage, share this story. The world needs more people willing to stand up quietly until the moment comes to stand up loudly. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our everyday life stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.